Well, good morning, church. My name is Terry Cartrite, and as you heard, I will be preaching. The rest of the story that you didn't hear there is, as soon as Brian saw this big piece of equipment out there, he got so excited that he might be able to drive it that he forgot he needed to prepare a sermon. So you're kind of stuck here. I want to start with a little short survey this morning. I'm going to ask you to do something that probably a preacher should never ask his congregation to do. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. The reason I shouldn't ask you to do that is because I know some of you and you won't open your eyes again until I'm done. But I want you to close your eyes and respond to a couple of statements. So everybody close their eyes and raise your hand if you agree, if Jesus said it, we should do it. All right? Keep your eyes closed. Here's the next thing for you to respond to. How many of you are excited to find out that I'll be preaching about money this morning? Well, there's about half a dozen of you. Go ahead and open your eyes. Please, all of you open your eyes. We're just not so excited to have somebody preach about money. Why is that? You know, a number of years ago, a large church in Denver asked their radio and television viewers, as well as their congregation, to write in and recommend to the pastor what they would like him to preach about. They had over 7,000 responses, and this pastor wrote a book about those sermons that had been requested. The last chapter of that book was about the sermon that wasn't requested. 7,000 responses, not one wanted a message on money or giving. Well, we're in a fundraising kind of a time right now. Hopefully we're getting kind of toward the end of that political fundraising. And I don't know if you feel this way or not, but I get tired of those calls. All the time, we're in a fundraising time of some kind. It might be a church. It might be political organizations. It might be charities. It might be school projects. All kinds of things. Pet shelters. And let me just say that there's a whole lot of those organizations that do really, really good work. But I get tired of people asking me for my money. And can I just confess to you that I don't always take those calls? If I think it's a fundraiser, I either hang up or I don't pick up at all. Do you get tired of people asking you for your money? I can tell you the reason I get tired of it is because that's my money. I worked hard for that money. And I want to spend that money on stuff that I want. Well, this morning I want to talk to you about the eternal value of your money and who among us is putting it where it counts. This morning's passage is found in Matthew 6, verses 19 through 21, and then following in 24. We'll start with verse 19. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart is also. Jesus had a lot to say about money. You probably heard statistics like 16 of his 38 parables were about money. That 5 times more is said about money than in prayer in the New Testament. That over 2,000 verses of 7,000 verses were about money, and Jesus taught more about money than any other subject. Well, I want to be careful throwing some of those statistics out. Some of them are more accurate than others, but the truth is, Jesus did have a lot to say about money. He had a lot to say about our possessions and our wealth. And he probably had a lot more to say than we wish he would have said. We live in a very materialistic society that is seemingly obsessed with wealth and the accumulation of it and the stuff that it buys. Now, the problem is not wealth itself. Jesus is not saying it's wrong to have money or to have things, but there's a big difference in using wealth as a tool or hoarding it for your own pleasure. Let me read verse 19 again. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. Jesus is giving us really good, sound investment advice here if we'll just pay attention to it. The first option, he says, is you can be focused on money and stuff. He's not saying that it's wrong to have stuff or it's sinful to buy stuff that we want, stuff that we need. He's not saying it's wrong to save money. What he's talking about is accumulating more and more just because we want to. Wanting more and more of what we already have enough of. You know, one of the problems with preaching up here is you think I'm preaching to you, but from up here, it's like that whole back wall is a mirror. And end up preaching to myself. See, I love guns, and I love to shoot them. So for decades, I prefer the word accumulate versus stockpile. Accumulate sounds a little softer than stockpiling, doesn't it? But I have been accumulating ammunition. First of all, so I'd have plenty available when I went to go shoot. Readily available, it's right there. And then prices started going up. So you buy all you can buy when you find a good deal. And then there's a shortage. So anytime you find some, you better buy all you can get because it may be hard to find. I find myself in a situation where I probably have more ammunition than I will ever have the opportunity to shoot. But just the other day, my son-in-law shared with me a link to a company that had a really good buy on ammunition. The conversation in my head went like this. You don't need any more ammunition. You don't have any place to store any more ammunition. But this is a really good deal. You should get some. And I did. Wanting more and more of what we already have plenty of. Another confession about how I think about my stuff. The other day, I was telling Rhonda and some friends, I said, you know, when we're raptured, we're in the presence of Jesus, and this stuff doesn't really matter. I mean, we're in heaven. I confess that it still feels kind of funny to me that this chaos that will be left on earth after that event, that there will be people breaking into my house, going through my stuff. Now, whatever your view of the rapture is, that's not the point. The point is, we like our stuff. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. Materialism may be God's greatest rival when it comes to competing for the allegiance of human hearts. Materialism may be God's greatest rival when it comes to competing for the allegiance of human hearts. Well, Jesus gives us a second option here in verse 20. He says, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. Doesn't that sound like a better place for your wealth? Doesn't it sound like a better investment strategy? To put it somewhere where it can't be lost. Well, how do we store up these treasures? Well, let's look at a couple other passages. Luke 12:33. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will not be exhausted, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Look at Matthew 19:21. Jesus is speaking to a rich young man who thought he had kept all of the commandments. And Jesus says, if you want to be perfect, go, sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Now, some of you have a little bit of a panicked look on your face. And I suppose that expression that I see from some of you is, you want me to sell everything and give it to the poor? That ain't happening. Well, let me be clear. Don't panic. Those two verses that I read, there are two verbs in each of those verses. One is to sell and one is to give. The main verb in both of those verses is to give. Jesus is not commanding you to sell everything that you have. What he's saying is there's a way to store up treasures in heaven, and that way is by giving here on earth. Jesus is saying the best investment is not in accumulating all the stuff that ultimately gets destroyed anyway. The best investment is in heavenly treasure, where it cannot be destroyed by moth or rust or thieves. Treasures that don't wear out, treasures that don't get used up, treasures that don't break down. And the way you store up heavenly treasures is by giving here on earth. The central truth I have for you today is this. God doesn't care how much you make, but he does care how much you give. God doesn't care how much you make, but he does care how much you give. You see, I believe this passage shows us that God doesn't put limits on what we can store up in heavenly treasures. There's another principle found in 2 Corinthians 9:6. It says, whoever sows sparingly will reap sparingly. Whoever sows generously will reap generously. God's far more concerned about our heart than he is our bank account. Now, it's generally considered bad taste to ask someone how much money they make. And if I was to ask you that, you'd probably tell me to mind my own business, and I think you'd probably be legitimate in saying that. But I wonder how many of us would be more uncomfortable with the question, how much do you give? Would you be embarrassed to answer that question? Or would you be grateful that God has blessed you in a way that you can store up heavenly treasures? Our passage continues in verse 21. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. You've heard the phrase, follow the money. We often refer to that in a criminal case or a murder or political motives, even how charitable groups spend their donations. You see, we believe that will show us when we follow the money. That will show us people's true motives and reveal a person's heart. Well, Junior and his wife were attending the state fair, which they had done for years and years. They got to the state fair and Junior said, Martha, you see that antique airplane over there? I'd sure like a ride in that airplane. Martha said, Junior, that airplane ride costs $10. And $10 is $10. So year after year, they continued to go to the state fair. Martha, I'd sure like to take a ride in that airplane. Junior, that airplane ride costs $10, and $10 is $10. Well, finally, one year, Junior said, Martha, I'm 81 years old. If I don't get to ride in that plane now, I may never get another opportunity. Martha said, Junior, that airplane ride's $10. And $10 is $10. Well, the pilot of the airplane heard that conversation. He came over to the couple and he said, folks, I'm sorry, I just couldn't help but overhear that conversation. Let me tell you what I'll do. I'll take you both up for a ride. And if you can keep your mouth shut the entire ride, the ride's free. But if either one of you say a word, it's $10. Junior and Martha talked it over, and they thought, yeah, let's do it. So off they go. Pilot takes off. He does everything he can do. He steep climbs, dives, loops, and everything. Not a word is said. So he thought, well, I'll do it again even faster this time. So he goes through everything all over again, loops and dives and everything he could think of. Not a word. Well, they land. The pilot turns to Junior and says, by golly, I did everything I could to get you to shout out, yet there was not a word. And Junior said, well, I thought about saying something when Martha fell out, but $10 is $10. Maybe that's the way you feel. $10 is $10, and that's my $10. Money Magazine reported a few years ago that we consume like no other culture before us because we pursue money like no other culture before us. They went on to say, money has become the number one obsession of Americans. We want the money and we want the stuff the money buys. We've been bitten by the affluence bug. And by the way, if you do something wrong, you can always try to use that affluenza defense. You didn't know any better. Well, a recent survey indicated that only 5% of churchgoers tithe. The average amount of giving per person is $17 a week. If every Christian tithed 10%, religious organizations would have $139 billion a year available for ministry. Now I want to bring that just a little bit closer to home, but I want to preface it with this. You've heard me say many, many times, and I hope you hear it again, you are a generous, generous church, and I appreciate that. Grace Chapel has somewhere between 215 and 250 people that give. We're going to use the number 215 just to be conservative. But if you take the average household income of Douglas County as reported by a recent census, you take 10% of that, a tithe, and you multiply that by the 215 people that give here at Grace Chapel, you come up with an annual giving of $3.6 million. Our proposed budget going into 2025, which is based on historical spending and giving and projected growth, is $1.2 million. Dramatic difference when everybody tithes. You know what you could do with that money? You could take half of it and you could plant 5 churches this year. You could take the other half and you could fully support 15 domestic or foreign missionaries. You could fully support a pregnancy center, a food bank, counseling centers, Christian schools, and it goes on and on. As a matter of fact, just this past week, we had a gentleman who was down on his luck, came to the church, needed some help, and because of your generous giving, we were able to help him. The list of what we can do in ministry opportunities is limitless if everybody would just tithe. Now, I know some of you are thinking that tithing thing, that's Old Testament. It's not found in the New Testament. Yeah, that's sort of true. See, the Old Testament gives us a guide, and it gives us a principle of abundant generosity. Abundant generosity. And that's carried throughout the New Testament. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Maybe we should all follow the money in our own life. If you're not sure where your heart is, I think Jesus would say, follow the money. Now I want to contrast two different attitudes that we see here in Scripture. The first one is found in Luke 21, verses 1 through 4. As he looked up, Jesus saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. I tell you the truth, he said, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave from their wealth, but she gave out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. You see that woman's attitude? Did she trust in earthly treasures? Or did she trust in God's provision and in heavenly treasures? Second attitude is found in Luke 12, starting in verse 16. And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. That does not relate to my ammo story, by the way. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. Do you see the attitude there? Was he storing up treasures on earth or in heaven? Two very different attitudes in those two passages of Scripture. One is giving all she had. The other is storing up, accumulating more and more for his own pleasure. Now, I'm not saying God's asking you to give up all you have. But I am asking you, where on that spectrum, from a woman who gave up all she had to the man who tore down his barn so he could accumulate more and more, where do you fall on that spectrum? You want to know where your heart is? Follow the money. Look at your bank statement. Look through your house, your garage, your storage unit. Just the other day, I heard a pastor in California was speaking to his congregation, and he said, you know, folks, there may be some tough economic times coming. You may need to prepare to sell your boat, your plane, or your second home. That just struck me as odd. He didn't say you might need to prepare for one good meal a day. You might need to prepare to move in with your family so you can help provide for each other. It's just an interesting perspective we have on stuff. Do you think we have too much stuff? All you have to do is look at how the storage business has been booming for decades. Now I want to wrap up this passage with verse 24. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and you'll love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Well, there's a famous pastor from Oklahoma. I won't mention his name because he's sitting back there. But he tells the story of a lady that came to see him one day, and she said, I'd like for you to perform the funeral for my dead cat, Homer. Well, he didn't want anything to do with that, so he recommended she go down the street and talk to the Presbyterian pastor. Presbyterian pastor didn't want anything to do with the cat's funeral either, so the lady came back to speak to the Baptist pastor. She was so distraught, she said, I don't know what I'm going to do. I really want a funeral for my cat, Homer. I was prepared to give the church $5,000 if they would have that funeral for the church. To which the pastor said, well, why didn't you tell me Homer was a Baptist in the first place? Money skews our thinking. Now, no one's going to argue that money and possessions and stuff have a place in our life. The question is, where is that place in your life? Jesus says when it comes to wealth, you got to choose your master. You cannot offer your ultimate allegiance to Jesus and to money at the same time. Randy Alcorn says this, you don't have to be rich for wealth to be your master. If wealth is on the throne, it doesn't mean you never think about God or that you never read the Bible or come to church. Outwardly, you can still be a pretty religious person and still be a servant of money. He goes on and says, you don't have to be poor to be a servant of God. If God is on the throne, it doesn't mean you never think about money, that you never need to buy anything you need or want, or that you're not concerned about your finances. You can handle money well and still be a servant of God. But whoever and wherever your ultimate treasure is, that's your master. Let me just give you a few things to think about. The first one is this. Learn to be content with less. A lot of times we buy things just to make ourselves feel better. Content people don't have to keep adding and accumulating things to be happy. Ecclesiastes 6:9 says, enjoy what you have rather than desiring what you don't have. Ecclesiastes 5:10, whoever loves money never has money enough. Well, there was an American factory that was operating in a third world country, and they paid their workers in cash. The problem was that when their workers found out that they had enough money, or they thought they had enough money to meet their needs, they quit working. So the innovative Americans came up with a plan. They provided each one of their workers with a Sears and Roebuck's catalog. The workers never felt like they had enough ever again. Someone wrote, change your measuring stick. Measure worth not by the things you have, but by the things that you would not take money for. Second thing is this. Cultivate the gift of giving by recognizing the right use of money. Money is a stewardship opportunity. It's an opportunity to bless others. You've been blessed so that you can bless others. Look for opportunities to give. Learn to give purposefully. Remember, God doesn't care how much you make, but He does care how much you give. The third thing is this. Recognize eternity for what it will bring. Your earthly treasures will not last, but those stored up in heaven will be there for eternity. 9 days ago, my mother passed away, and she was 98 years old. 98 is pretty good time to live on this earth. Most of us will probably not make it to 98. But 98 years on this earth is but a blink of an eye in eternity. So do you want to store up your treasures for the blink of an eye? Or do you want to store up your treasures for eternity? It comes down to this, folks. Those who are generous on earth and storing up treasures in heaven, that indicates that they've chosen God as their master. And those who are stingy here on earth and store up treasures here and none in heaven have chosen money as their master. See, having money is not the problem. The danger comes when money has you. When we're possessed by our possessions. When physical things are more important than spiritual things. When a person focuses nearly day and night on wealth building, basing nearly every decision they make on that, but try to also claim that they're in it for serving God, you can't have it both ways. Jesus is not speaking against material gain. But it always must be secondary to our relationship with God. I ask you to be honest with yourself. Where's your heart? Is it set on earthly treasure or heavenly treasure? I can't answer that for you. I can only answer that for me. Our status on earth might be based on how much money we make and how much stuff we have. But our status in heaven is determined by how much we give away here on earth.